The sun bore down like a hammer on the empty prairie, turning the dry grass to brittle gold and the air into rippling waves of heat. Samuel Granger, a quiet rancher in his late 40s, rode slowly along the fence line of his property, reins slack in one hand, a coil of wire in the other. He had lived on this land for 9 years without a neighbor in sight by choice. After losing his wife and infant daughter to fever in Kansas, he'd sold everything, loaded what little he owned onto a wagon, and followed the sun west until the land stopped talking and started listening. He bought 200 acres with his last coins, hammered a cabin into the soil with his bare hands, and hadn't looked back since. He preferred it that way, just him, the land, and the quiet hum of wind through mesquite. The valley rarely saw anyone pass through anymore. The nearest town, Bitter Creek, was a good 20 miles off, and even there, he only went once a month for supplies. So when his horse snorted and sidestepped near the edge of the old dry creek bed, Samuel pulled the reins and squinted toward the dust. At first he thought it was a bundle of old blankets discarded by some trapper or migrant, but something about the shape tugged at him. He dismounted, cautiously stepped closer, boots crunching on dry soil. That's when he saw the hand, a thin, dirt-caked limb stretched out toward nothing. The man lay face down, half covered in dust and blood. His long black hair was matted and stuck to the cracked skin of his face. One leg was twisted oddly beneath him. His lips were cracked open, whispering without sound. Samuel knelt beside the man, instinctively pulling the cork from his canteen. He didn't think about it. He didn't pause to wonder if the man was dangerous, or if someone was watching from the ridgeline. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the look in the man's eyes. Not fear, not anger, just pleading. A human being clinging to one last flicker of life. "Here," Samuel said softly, holding the canteen to the man's lips. "Slow, just sip." The man drank like his soul depended on it. Water ran down his chin, soaking into his torn shirt. He closed his eyes, breathing shallow and broken. Samuel scanned the horizon. No riders, no dust trails. Whoever this man was, he was alone, and judging by the blood staining his side and the swelling in his ankle, he wouldn't last another hour in the sun. Samuel wiped sweat from his brow and made a decision. Carefully, he slid his arms beneath the man and lifted him, surprised at how light he was. More bone than flesh. He carried him to his horse, tying the reins to the saddle horn, and walked the mile back to the cabin on foot. The man didn't speak once, not even to groan, just breathed in rasping gulps, gripping the canteen like a child with a lifeline. The ranch house was small but clean. Samuel laid the man on his own bed, fetched a basin of water, and washed the blood and dirt away with a rag. The wound in his side looked like it had been made by a blade, long and angry, but not too deep. Maybe an ambush, maybe soldiers, or maybe something worse. Samuel didn't ask. He wasn't ready to hear the answer. By evening, the stranger slept under a blanket, breathing slow and steady. Samuel sat outside on the porch, boots up on the railing, pipe resting unlit in his teeth. He stared out across the open plains, where shadows stretched long across the golden sea of grass. He didn't know who the man was, didn't know what tribe he came from or what danger might follow. But in the quiet of that dying day, Samuel Granger felt something shift inside him. It had been years since he let anyone this close. Years since he looked at another man and saw something more than a threat or a burden. That night, he didn't sleep. He just sat with his rifle across his lap and the front door open, watching the moon rise over the hills. He thought about mercy and fences and the strange way fate delivers its messengers, silent, bleeding, and half buried in dust. Inside the one-room cabin, the man lay still as stone, though his chest rose and fell with stubborn rhythm. Samuel sat at the table with a lantern burning low, the yellow light flickering across a half-finished journal entry he could no longer focus on. He glanced over his shoulder now and again, watching the rise and fall of the stranger's chest, as if expecting it to stop at any moment. It didn't. The man had a will to live. That much was clear. And Samuel, for reasons he hadn't yet untangled, had chosen to help him survive. He should have felt proud, or at least at peace. But the longer the cabin remained silent, the more Samuel felt a strange weight growing inside him. That morning, he had simply acted on instinct, a gut reflex that didn't ask for consequences. But now, in the stillness of evening, with no wind, no cattle sounds, no distant coyotes, he began to think. Samuel wasn't ignorant of the world outside his valley. He had once served as a scout for a territorial survey team, had ridden through tribal lands, dodged arrows, shared bitter coffee with nervous officers who spat words like savage and heathen without a second thought. He'd seen what progress looked like: burned-out villages, broken treaties, and children crying over blood-soaked blankets. He had never lifted a rifle against a native man, but he had stood silently in the background while others did. That silence, over time, had become a second skin. Easier not to speak, easier to keep your head down and build a fence around your conscience. He had done just that physically and spiritually on this land. And now, without warning, that quiet life had cracked open with the sound of labored breathing on a wooden floor. The stranger stirred once during the night, reaching for water, and muttered a few words Samuel didn't understand. The voice was rough, unused. Samuel helped him sip from the cup, then eased him back onto the pillow. He saw the faint lines tattooed on the man's wrist, dribble markings. Maybe a story written in ink only his people could read. "Don't try to talk," Samuel whispered. "You're safe here." But even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure it was true. The valley was quiet, but it wasn't isolated from the world. If this man was part of a tribe, someone would come looking. Or worse, someone would be hunting him. Samuel thought of the militias that still roamed the territories, men with guns and grudges who needed no reason to shoot. He thought of cavalry scouts who might see a native man in a white man's home and jump to the worst conclusions. What if they came tomorrow? What if they came tonight? He shook the thought away, walking to the stove and reheating some leftover beans. As the fire crackled, the air warmed, and Samuel's mind drifted back to Kansas, back to a different porch, a different fire, a softer voice. His wife Marla had always believed in helping strangers. She would have helped the man without hesitation. "The good Lord doesn't ask who deserves mercy," she used to say, "he just asks if you have any to give." Samuel had often scoffed at that sentiment in their younger years. But now, sitting alone with a wounded warrior in the next room, he wondered if that had been the part of her he missed the most. Not just her kindness, but her courage. Her ability to believe that goodness wasn't weakness. The beans tasted like ash in his mouth. He set the bowl aside and walked back outside, rifle in hand, taking a seat on the porch steps. The stars had come out in clusters, sprawling wide over the dark plain. He could hear nothing but the ticking of insects and the occasional rustle of dry leaves. No movement on the ridge lines, no shadows near the fence. Still, he kept his rifle close. He didn't know if he had just saved a warrior or invited danger, but something told him the act would not go unanswered. There was a weight to certain choices, like throwing a stone into still water. You never see where the ripples end. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Morning would come soon enough. Samuel awoke just before dawn, as he always did, stirred from light sleep by years of habit and the restless chirp of prairie birds. He rubbed the back of his neck, sore from dozing upright in his rocking chair. The rifle still sat across his lap, and the cabin was silent save for the faint breathing of the stranger in the next room. He stood slowly, stepped out onto the porch, and stretched. The air was still, cool and dry, a welcome break from the punishing heat of the day before. The stars still hung faintly above the western horizon, and the first gray hints of morning clung to the eastern hills. He walked out past the porch steps and glanced up at the ridgelines that bordered his land. Everything looked as it always had, nothing but low sagebrush, empty trails, and wide, sleeping sky. Still, something tugged at his gut, the kind of feeling you couldn't put into words, only recognize if you'd lived long enough on your own to trust instincts over logic. And then he heard it, a sound like thunder, but too steady, too deliberate. Faint at first, like a memory in the wind, then closer hooves, dozens of them. Samuel turned slowly toward the eastern hills, heart drumming hard. The rising light painted the rim of the horizon in soft gold. Dust trailed in wide columns across the flat plain, the kind of dust only a large group of riders could kick up. He stepped back onto the porch and reached for the spyglass he kept hanging near the doorframe. Pressing it to his eye, he scanned the land beyond the eastern fence. His stomach tightened. Riders, at least 100 of them, perhaps more, bareback, feathered headdresses catching the morning light, long rifles strapped across their backs, bows at their sides. A war party, and not a small one. He lowered the spyglass and let out a breath. For a moment, he stood motionless, staring out at the growing wave of riders. They moved without haste but with great purpose, fanning out as they neared the ranch. By the time the first line crossed the eastern boundary of his land, more had appeared from the north and south, circling wide to encase the cabin in a loose but unmistakable formation. He wasn't just being visited, he was being surrounded. Samuel didn't move. He didn't reach for his rifle. He knew well enough that if these men meant harm, no weapon he had would stop them. He could feel the power in their movement, not just strength in numbers, but unity, discipline. They weren't a mob. They were organized, trained, and silent. That silence was louder than any war cry he had ever heard. The sun crested the hill behind them, and for a moment, the light turned every horse and rider into shadow and flame. It was an awe-inspiring sight, fearsome, yes, but majestic too. Samuel had never seen anything like it, and then, without warning, the line broke. From the eastern front, a single rider pushed forward. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in fur-lined buckskin, he rode a black stallion and carried no weapon in hand. Behind him, others began to dismount. Elders, by their appearance, they moved slowly and deliberately, walking toward the house with the solemnity of men who carried history on their backs. Samuel remained on the porch, heart pounding in his chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through his head. Had they come for revenge? Did they believe he'd harmed the wounded man? Or had the act of kindness he'd offered been seen as a trespass? Then he heard the door creak behind him. The stranger, now bandaged, weak but standing, had stepped outside. He leaned on the doorframe, eyes sunken but alert, his left hand raised in what seemed like a gesture of recognition. The moment was electric. From the formation of riders, a few raised their fists in reply. Samuel turned to look at him. The man didn't speak, but nodded once, and just like that, Samuel understood. This wasn't an attack, it was a reckoning, a gathering, an answer. The man who now stood at Samuel's porch, silhouetted in the orange gleam of dawn, seemed like a figure carved out of the very earth, weathered, proud, and older than any map could show. He did not speak. His presence alone demanded silence. The way he sat astride his horse was slow, deliberate. Stillness made it clear that he was not merely a leader of warriors. He was something greater, the kind of man who could carry the burden of generations without it bending his shoulders. Samuel instinctively stepped aside, giving the stranger full view of the wounded man, now leaning in the doorway. A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled riders. No shouts, no chants, just a sharp intake of breath. The murmurs that passed between men who hadn't seen one of their own in a long time. One rider, younger and leaner, broke formation and came forward, his pace quick and desperate. He had a long braid that swung behind him and a scar down one cheek. Samuel watched as the young man leaped from his horse and ran the last few yards on foot. The wounded man, his strength nearly gone, straightened just enough to stand tall. Their eyes locked hand for a moment, nothing else existed. The young warrior dropped to one knee, pressed his hand to the elder's chest, and whispered a single word that Samuel didn't understand. But the way the old man raised his hand, placed it gently on the younger's shoulder, and smiled, Samuel didn't need translation. It was his son, his only son. Emotion flickered across the wounded man's face, subtle but profound. His hand trembled, not from pain this time, but from the sheer weight of reunion. The young man helped him sit in a chair just inside the doorway, then turned to Samuel. For a moment, the two men simply regarded one another, the rancher and the warrior's son. Neither moved, neither blinked. Then, with slow formality, the younger man stepped forward, drew something from a leather pouch at his side, and placed it gently on the porch railing. It was a carved wooden token, shaped like a bird in flight, wings outstretched. Samuel glanced at it, then back at the man. No words were spoken, but Samuel felt the meaning like thunder in his chest. It was a symbol of honor, of debt, of something far older than currency. A token not just of gratitude, but of acknowledgement. Samuel had given water to a dying man, not a stranger, not a threat, but a father, a respected figure among warriors. And now the son repaid him in the only way he could, by marking him as one who had acted with humanity when no one was watching. More elders stepped forward now, their faces lined with age and wind, their clothing heavy with beads and bone. They did not speak either, but some gave nods, others pressed their hands to their hearts. It was not a ceremony, but it felt like one. It wasn't loud, but it shook Samuel deeper than any sound ever could. He felt out of place on his own land. He, who had built this cabin with his own two hands, now stood like a guest on his own porch, humbled by a gathering of those who knew something he was just beginning to understand, that every action, even one as simple as giving water, echoes beyond the body and into the soul. The sun had now fully risen, casting long shadows across the prairie, painting the riders in golden light. Dozens more stood still on horseback, watching in silence, bearing witness. Samuel glanced out at them all. 300, maybe more, warriors, elders, mothers with infants tied to their backs. All gathered, not for war, but for reverence. Samuel turned toward the wounded man again. Their eyes met, and for the first time, the man spoke in a voice so hoarse it barely crossed the porch. "You saved me." Just 3 words. But they held the weight of 1,000 years. Samuel nodded, unable to speak. The younger warrior, his son, stepped forward once more and said, in clear, deliberate English, "You gave our elder water when no one else would. That does not go unanswered." Samuel swallowed hard, unsure how to reply. But deep in his chest, something cracked open, something long buried and forgotten. Not fear, not pride, but a quiet, blooming sense of belonging. The sun rose higher, casting golden beams across the wide prairie and lighting the figures that had encircled Samuel's ranch. Though still silent, the gathering had shifted. What began as a solemn, almost mournful arrival of riders was now slowly transforming into something different. Not celebration, exactly, but renewal. Riders dismounted in respectful waves, many of them making their way toward the cabin in ones and twos. Some bringing woven satchels, others carrying carved staffs or bundles of herbs and cloth. Women with long braids and painted faces approached the porch with quiet grace, bowing slightly as they passed Samuel, not as a subject bows to a king, but as one soul acknowledges another. Samuel stood frozen, still unsure whether to retreat into his house or offer something: words, water, space. But it became clear very quickly. This was not a visit. It was a vigil. It was a return. They had come not just for the elder, but for what had been done in his hour of need. Soon, a small Circle had formed in the front yard, about 20 to 30 people, old and young, seated cross-legged on buffalo hides laid out upon the ground. Someone started singing, soft and slow, the melody unfamiliar, yet so deeply human that Samuel felt it in his ribs. The language was not his own, but the tone transcended language. Grief, gratitude, memory. A second voice joined in, then a third. The circle began to move slightly, leaning together, breathing in unison like a single living being. Smoke rose from a small fire built without Samuel even noticing. It smelled of sweetgrass and cedar. The wounded man had now been placed on a padded mat just inside the doorway. His son remained close by, tending to him with the tender hands of a boy trying to remember his father's strength. Occasionally, he would whisper something into the elder's ear, and the older man would nod. Barely. He was weakening. That much was obvious. The ride to Samuel's ranch had drained him, and though he was conscious, he was quiet now, his strength flickering like the end of a candle. But he was not alone. Not anymore. Samuel sat down slowly on the edge of the porch, overwhelmed by the steady rhythm of movement and sound. He had not seen this many people in one place since leaving Kansas all those years ago, and certainly never like this, not on his land, not under his roof. He thought about how he'd spent the last 10 years, herding cattle, mending fences, tending a small garden, and trying to forget the world he'd come from. He had buried his past in the soil of the prairie, thinking himself safe from all the cruelty and noise of civilization. But now, surrounded by hundreds of people from a culture older and deeper than any he'd ever known, he realized he hadn't escaped the world. He had simply hidden from the parts of it that still had something sacred to offer. The young warrior returned to Samuel with a clay bowl of water and a handmade blanket embroidered with feathers and symbols. He didn't speak, just offered both with outstretched hands. Samuel took them slowly, gently, feeling the fabric between his fingers, soft and worn, but full of life. He nodded in thanks, unsure whether to bow or shake hands. The young man simply placed his hand over his heart and gave a single nod. That gesture, so simple, so rich, said more than words could. In the distance, new riders began arriving more than before. Some were on foot, others in wagons. Children ran alongside their mothers, chasing shadows, laughing quietly. This was no longer a response to one man's injury. This was something else, a moment, a return. Perhaps the elder had been missing for years. Perhaps they thought him dead. Perhaps Samuel's act had brought more than just one man home. It had opened the gate for an entire clan to come together. And still, none of them asked for anything. Not food, not shelter. They brought their own. They moved respectfully around Samuel's barn and pastures, tending to their horses with practiced care, never intruding, never shouting. The silence they carried was not empty, it was deliberate. Samuel had never seen such discipline in such numbers. It made the military parades of his childhood seem childish and loud by comparison. As the sun reached its peak and the land shimmered under its heat, Samuel finally felt the weight of what had begun. This was more than a gathering. This was ceremony, and he, a lone rancher who once wanted nothing more than to be left alone, now sat at the center of something ancient. And it had all begun with a single cup of water. The sun had risen high above the prairie, casting long beams across the land, baking the red dust and turning the tall grass into waves of golden fire. Around the ranch, the circle of warriors had settled into quiet, respectful stillness. Some sat beneath the shadows of the cottonwoods. Others stood near their horses, whispering softly or watching the horizon, but always with one eye turned toward the cabin and the man resting within. The elder had remained seated just inside the doorway, resting on thick hides and wrapped in the blanket Samuel had once draped over him the night he was found. His breathing had grown shallow, but his eyes, dark and deep, still held fire. Now, with a suddenness that startled even those nearby, he raised one hand into the air, palm open. A hush fell over everyone. The music stopped, conversations died to silence. It was as if the land itself listened. Samuel, still seated on the edge of the porch, looked up. The wounded man's voice came hoarse, gravel-thick, yet somehow resonant as he began to speak in his own tongue. His son, kneeling beside him, translated each sentence into slow, clear English. "I was left to die beneath the sky," the son said, his voice calm. "My blood in the dirt, my breath fading. No brother beside me. No horse beneath me. I called to the wind, I asked the spirits to carry me." A pause, but they did not take me, the son continued. "Because a man with no name to me, no Bondo tribe, offered water from his own hands. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask why I was wounded. He gave what I needed when I needed it." A murmur moved through the crowd. Eyes glistened. Some bowed their heads. Samuel felt the air thicken. His chest tightened. The elder was looking straight at him now. That same stare from the night before, piercing, not cruel, but deep. It was the look of a man who sees through skin and bone, who sees intention and spirit. "I have walked many winters," the man said, through his son. "I have seen fire and peace, betrayal and loyalty. But never did I expect to meet an honest hand from the white world when death stood so near." His voice faltered. He coughed, pain flickering across his face like lightning. But he raised his hand again, forcing strength into each motion. "This man," the son translated, pointing to Samuel, "is now part of our story." The elder reached beside him and drew out a long object wrapped in deer hide. Slowly, the son unwrapped it, revealing a narrow wooden staff painted, feathered, and etched with dozens of markings. Time had worn some away, but others stood bold and bright, symbols of rivers, wolves, mountains, sunrises, arrows. It was not a weapon, it was a staff of memory, a totem. "This," the elder said, "is passed only to those who leave a mark on our journey." He extended it toward Samuel. For a long moment, the rancher didn't move. His hands remained in his lap, unsure. He looked to the son, who nodded once firm proud. Samuel stood slowly. His boots felt heavy. Every step toward the elder felt like it stretched across decades. When he finally reached him, he knelt, in submission, but in respect. The elder placed the staff into Samuel's hands. His fingers lingered there, holding the rancher's wrists as if transferring something unseen, something weightless, yet heavy with meaning. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some raised their hands, others closed their eyes. In silence, they accepted this act not as a gesture but as law. Samuel stood with the staff in hand. It felt warm, alive, carved by years, carried through fire, now placed in his grasp. The son spoke one final sentence, his voice louder now, for all to hear. "You saved a life. We give you a place among us." It was not adoption, not some forced inclusion. It was acknowledgement. He had acted with no motive but mercy. And now, in return, the elder had bound his name Samuel into their lineage. Not as a warrior, not as a chief, but as a man who chose kindness when he could have chosen distance. For Samuel, it was too much to speak on. His throat was tight, his eyes, unaccustomed to tears, stung in the sun. He lowered his head, not in shame, but humility. All around him, the circle of riders bowed too, and the elder, breathing heavily, closed his eyes, his final duty complete. By late afternoon, the prairie had turned to bronze, and the breeze that once swept across the open land now seemed to slow, as if time itself was pausing to honor the weight of the moment. The sun lowered inch by inch, casting longer shadows from the cottonwoods and drawing warm tones across the silent faces of the assembled riders. The wounded elder, now honored and heard, lay still on the mat inside the cabin. His breath came soft and slow. He had not spoken again since giving Samuel the staff. That had been his last great offering, and those who knew him understood. He was preparing to walk the final trail. Samuel remained near, seated not far from the threshold. He hadn't left the spot since the gift was placed in his hands. The staff still rested across his knees, its presence grounding him like an anchor to something far older than any memory he carried. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about chores or weather or the worn ache in his right knee. His mind was with the man who now lay still and the people who surrounded him. As the sun neared the edge of the western hills, the clan began to gather once more, this time in complete silence. Wordlessly, they formed a wide circle around the cabin. Warriors and elders, mothers with infants, boys barely old enough to ride. No voice broke the stillness. No hoof struck the earth. Even the horses, as if sensing what was near, stood motionless, their ears flicking but not moving from their places. Samuel stood as the young warrior. The sun emerged from the cabin. He carried nothing, but the look on his face was unmistakable. The moment had come. The sun looked toward the sky, then down to the earth. He knelt and pressed his palm to the soil, whispering something too soft for Samuel to hear. Then he arose and addressed the circle in his native tongue. Though Samuel couldn't understand the words, their rhythm carried sorrow, pride, and reverence. The speech lasted only a minute, perhaps two, and then the son turned toward Samuel. "He walks now," the son said in English, his voice steady, though his eyes were damp. "He walks to the ancestors with his head high." Samuel swallowed the knot in his throat. There were no proper words to say back. None would be enough. Two warriors stepped into the cabin and emerged moments later carrying the elder's body on a bier made of tightly woven branches. It was wrapped in buffalo hide, marked with hand-painted symbols: eagles, rivers, mountain paths. At the head lay the same carved token the son had offered Samuel earlier. The body was lifted high and passed through the gathered clan like a sacred current, every hand brushing the bier as it moved, each touch a farewell. They did not bury him there. Instead, they would carry him far beyond the far bluffs, to sacred ground where their ancestors rested. This visit had not been meant to end in death, but the way they moved with intention and dignity showed Samuel that they had always been prepared for this possibility. They were a people who had lost much, but never forgot how to honor. The sun touched the horizon as the final group of warriors mounted their horses. The bier placed carefully on a platform carried between two strong bays. The clan began to move, slowly at first, with the son leading the way, riding without expression, his father's spirit now behind him. No one looked back. Not once. That, too, was part of their way. What is honored is not clung to. It is let go, with dignity. Samuel stood alone on the porch. the staff still in his grip, watching until the last shadow faded over the distant rise. Only dust remained in the air, and a silence that didn't feel empty, but full, echoing with something sacred. He looked down at the staff, tracing the old carvings with a calloused thumb. He felt it again, the invisible thread that now tied him to something beyond himself, not by blood, not by birth, but by choice. He had given water, nothing more. Yet in doing so, he had given life, and now he had received something that could not be bought or traded, a place in the memory of a people. Night fell soft and slow. The stars blinked into view above the ranch, and for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel alone. He felt watched, guarded, belonging. The days that followed passed with a stillness Samuel had never known. It wasn't the ordinary hush of the prairie or the usual rhythm of ranch life. It was deeper, like something ancient had touched the land and left a trace behind. He moved through his days as before, feeding the horses, mending fences, tending the fire, but everything had shifted. The water in the troughs seemed clearer, the wind softer, the sky somehow wider. His solitude, once hard as rock, now felt porous open. The silence no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed. The staff, the one gifted to him by the dying elder, remained inside the cabin. He had built a small alcove on the wall, where morning sun would strike it first. Each time he walked past, his eyes would find the curved markings, the worn grip, the painted feathers. He didn't touch it often. Somehow it didn't feel like his to use, but he kept it clean, wrapped in buckskin, as carefully as if it were a living thing. People from town came now and then, asking questions. A passing mail rider mentioned seeing a caravan of Indians on the ridge. Must have been 100 of them, he'd said, wide-eyed, all moving quiet, like ghosts. Samuel only nodded. He never told the full story, not out of pride, but because words seemed too small. You couldn't describe what had happened in just a sentence or two, not to people who wouldn't understand. The weight of a gift given without ceremony, or the presence of a people who honored the dying with silence rather than speeches. What he had experienced didn't belong in town gossip. It belonged to the land. Occasionally, weeks apart, Samuel would find small offerings left at the edge of his property. A woven pouch tied to a fence post. A carved figure nestled at the base of a tree. Once, he discovered a deerskin bundle filled with dried herbs and a single eagle feather. No notes, no names, just signs, reminders, proof that he had not been forgotten and that they were still watching. One early morning, while feeding the horses, he heard the distant cry of a hawk and looked up. Against the sky stood a lone rider, barely visible, framed by the rising sun. Samuel stared for a long time, but the rider did not wave or call out. He simply turned his horse and vanished behind the hills. He smiled. Something had changed inside him. The man who once shunned company, who avoided strangers, who came to the prairie to escape his past, now felt more tied to this place than ever before. It was no longer a hideout. It was home. And in that home, there lived the memory of an old warrior who had died with honor, surrounded by those who loved him. Because a stranger had offered him water, Samuel often sat at dusk by the fire, a tin cup in hand, the flames dancing shadows across the walls. On some nights, he would speak softly, as if the elder were still nearby. Not prayers, not out loud, just thoughts sent out into the prairie wind, thanks, questions, small stories. And sometimes, when the stars were especially bright and the coyotes were silent, he thought he could feel the weight of 100 hoofbeats far off in the dark. Not a threat, not a return, just remembrance. He had lived alone for years. But after that morning, after those 300 riders stood at his gate, he was never truly alone again. The prairie held his story now, along with theirs.